Moscow. Sunday evening. The 5th day of May, 2019. The city is just beginning to breathe the warmth of spring. Somewhere it already smells of rain, somewhere the rumble of thunder is heard. But at Sheremetyevo airport, everything goes on as usual, a well-functioning mechanism of a huge hub through which tens of thousands of people pass every day. The usual bustle reigns inside the terminal. Passengers run past shops, someone is hastily drinking coffee, someone is looking impatiently at the clock. No one even suspects that right now, in this crowd, there are people who were about to find themselves in the center of events that shook the whole country. A Sukhoi Superjet 100 is preparing to take off on the platform. At first glance, it looks like an ordinary airplane, a white body with orange, blue Aeroflot lines, metal gleaming at sunset. But this liner is a symbol of an entire era. The first Russian passenger aircraft built in the 21st century is the pride of the industry, which was supposed to prove that the country is able to compete on equal terms with Airbus and Boeing. It looked modern, confident, and reassuring to passengers. If the plane was new, it meant it was reliable. In the cockpit, the crew checks the systems. The commander is Denis Evdokimov. 42 years old, more than 6,500 flight hours. His experience includes not only years in civil aviation, but also military service on the heavy Illinois 76. He saw the sky differently, in clear weather and in conditions where every decision could cost too much. Then there were the years of work at Transaero on Boeing, and it seemed that fate had brought him to aviation forever. After the bankruptcy of the company, Evdokimov ended up at Aeroflot and switched to a new type, the Sukhoi Superjet. For many colleagues, he was an example of confidence and discipline. The first officer is sitting next to him. Young, only 36 years old, but with much more modest experience. I graduated from college 3 years ago, completed additional training, and only 6 months ago I got the right to fly a Superjet. His role is not only to help the captain, but also to learn, observe, and gradually gain experience. 2 people met in this cabin, one with thousands of watches on his back, the other with hundreds. And at that moment, no one guessed that it was the combination of their decisions and actions that would become the central link of a future catastrophe. The dispatcher transmits the data for departure. The scheme is simple, KN-24E. After takeoff, turn 180 degrees and set course through the Costino checkpoint. Everything is standard, everything is predictable. But aviation differs in that, even in standard conditions, there is always a factor that changes everything. Today, the weather has become this factor. A thunderstorm front was looming right along the route. There was a bright spot on the crew's radars that moved from left to right. For an experienced pilot, this is a signal, you need to be careful. For passengers, a thunderstorm is just a beautiful picture outside the window, flashes of lightning that can even cause delight. But for a pilot, a thunderstorm is an enemy. The most dangerous hostile element in the sky. Lightning scares with its spectacular nature, but it is far from the main threat. Modern aircraft are able to withstand the impact of a discharge. The current passes through their body and goes into the atmosphere. The plane just shakes, and that's it. Much more frightening is the powerful updrafts and downdrafts. They are able to throw a liner weighing several tens of tons up, and then throw it down, as if it were a toy. It is these air traps that break the trajectory, knock down the glide path and can make landing almost impossible. The commander looks at the radar and realizes that there is a thunderstorm ahead. But his voice sounds calm, "We're following the plan, guys." This short phrase seems to set the accents. An experienced pilot makes a decision to trust the scheme. It's commonplace for him. It's an inconspicuous detail for passengers. But it is precisely in such small things that the forks of fate are born. There are 73 people on board at this moment. Someone returns home, someone flies to work, someone dreams of being in a northern city where relatives are waiting. The cabin has a normal atmosphere, passengers put their things away, check their phones, and make themselves comfortable. For them, everything that is happening is just the beginning of the path. An hour and a half in the air, and they are right where they need to be. None of them realize that in a few minutes their plane will find itself in a situation from which there will be almost no way out. Clouds are gathering outside. The sky is darkening faster than usual. It would seem that it's just rain, just a spring thunderstorm. But right now, the sky was preparing to test who would be stronger, man and technology or the elements. Aviation always balances between two worlds. On the one hand, there is iron confidence in technology. Thousands of flights are completed safely every day. Statistics show that the plane is the safest transport. On the other hand, there is the eternal uncertainty of the sky, where every thunderstorm can become a deadly challenge. Metal against lightning. Man against the elements. In a few minutes, the plane will take off from the ground. And what started as a routine Moscow-Murmansk flight will turn into a drama that the whole world will be watching with bated breath. When the crew pulls into the lane, it seems that everything around is forming a familiar picture. The cabin is quiet, just the rhythmic voice of the onboard instruments and the familiar rustle of checklists. Everything is going according to the standard, the warning lights are on in the right places, the engine parameters are stable, and the systems are working normally. For passengers, this is a minute of easy waiting. The plane is standing still, the engines are humming steadily, and it seems that time has stopped. But the pilots know that this is just a lull. There is a long takeoff acceleration ahead and a decision from which there will be no turning back. When the captain rolls the plane out into the middle of the runway and levels it out, the cabin air seems to become denser. Lightning flashes in the distance. Permission to take off comes after 5 minutes of waiting. It's not much, but in such conditions, every minute makes your heart beat faster. The captain calmly takes the helm, pushes the thrust levers forward. The engines of the RRJ-95 roared behind him, and the liner, weighing several tens of tons, begins to gain speed. Acceleration pushes passengers into their seats, and the lane flashes faster and faster. At a speed of 285 km per hour, the commander pulls the steering wheel, and the wheels lift off the ground. The plane seems to break out into another reality, from the usual human space into a zone where everything obeys only the laws of physics and the skills of the crew. At an altitude of 200 meters, the commander turns on the autopilot. This is a standard procedure. Automation helps to guide the aircraft along the route without unnecessary strain on the pilots. Everything looks reliable. But it is at this moment that the captain decides to change the trajectory. Instead of following strictly according to the plan, he turns aside a little earlier to avoid the storm front. This decision can be called cautious, but as time will show, it will be only the first link in a long chain of events. It might shake a little, Evdokimov says. The voice is calm, almost casual. The first officer answers briefly, "Oh." And silence reigns again. The flight has just begun, and no one thinks that these words will be a harbinger of a nightmare. Half a minute later, the storm hits back. Lightning cuts through the sky and hits the plane directly. For passengers, this moment is like a camera flash, a bright light outside the window and a dull hum. It's an alarm for the crew. The autopilot turns off, the onboard systems are rebuilt, and the liner goes into direct mode. For the average viewer, these words mean little. But for a pilot, this is a completely different reality. Direct mode is the direct control of a machine without the usual computer support. If in normal mode the automation smooths out movements and errors, making the reaction of the aircraft smooth, now every touch of the joystick is directly transmitted to the steering surfaces. The slightest wrong move and the car will jerk as if nervous. The controls are becoming too sensitive, as if the driver of a passenger car suddenly moved into a Formula One car. The commander reacts quickly. He tilts the steering wheel slightly to the left, then forward. But then his movements become abrupt, almost chaotic. In 18 seconds, he changes the position of the handle more than 10 times. The plane is wobbling, and passengers in the cabin feel strange tremors, although they still do not understand what happened. And yet, despite the lightning strike, there is no catastrophe yet. The aircraft has not lost its power supply, the engines are running. The systems are limited, but in general, the liner is able to continue flying. According to the instructions, the crew could easily have brought the flight to Murmansk, or at least chosen the nearest major airport with clear weather. But Evdokimov makes another decision, to return to Sheremetyevo. From that moment on, the flight turns into a race between time, the elements and human decisions. Radio communication is interrupted, the crew tries to call the dispatcher, but to no avail. The main station is silent. An alarm occurs in the cockpit, the plane is in the air, and communication with the ground is lost. This is one of the worst scenarios for any pilot. The passengers in the cabin don't know anything yet. Someone is looking out the window at the darkening sky, someone is falling asleep in an armchair. For them, it's still an ordinary flight, albeit with mild turbulence. But a struggle is already beginning in the cockpit, a struggle for control, for the right decision, for the chance to return to Earth. And although no one sees the fire ahead yet, it is already waiting for them on the runway. In the sky, everything happened quickly and as if without warning. As soon as the plane reached a safe altitude and went into a turn, the sky burst into flames. A white flash tore through the clouds, and the liner was right in its center. The lightning entered the nose, passed through the fuselage, and then entered the atmosphere through the tail section. For passengers, it looked like instant blindness, bright light outside the windows, ringing in the ears, and darkness again. Someone screamed, but most of them didn't even realize what had happened. For the pilots, it was the moment of truth. The autopilot shut down, as if someone had pulled the plug. New indicators flashed on the dashboard, and the system switched to direct mode. For an ordinary passenger, this sounds like a technical detail. But for the commander, who was used to the help of automation, it was akin to the driver suddenly losing the power steering and the anti-lock braking system at the same time. The machine only listens to direct hand movements. The Superjet becomes unpredictable in this mode. Every slight movement of the side joystick causes the wings to respond too abruptly. If the computer smooths out the trajectory in normal mode, now it's just an observer. The plane seems to come alive, reacting to any touch too nervously. The captain acts reflexively. He tilts the joystick slightly to the left, then forward, correcting the course. But instead of a smooth flight, the liner begins to sway slightly. In a short 18 seconds, Evdokimov changes the joystick position more than 10 times, the movements are abrupt, sometimes impulsive. The car reacts in jerks, and the first tremors appear in the cabin. Passengers grab onto the armrests, someone jokes that it's turbulence, someone is cautiously silent. But the worst part is not turning off the autopilot. The worst thing is the sudden silence on the radio. The first officer tries to call the dispatcher, but there is only hissing in his headphones. The radio station is silent. The crew understands that the connection is lost. There are dozens of planes in the sky over Moscow, and they are alone, with damaged equipment and without a communication channel with the ground. They include the emergency code 7600. On the dispatcher's screens, their mark changes color. It is now clear that this flight has lost contact. They see the problem from the ground, but it's difficult to help remotely. At this point, the liner turns into a closed world where only the crew makes the decision. This is where the dilemma arises. The plane is still able to fly, the engines are running, the electrical system is intact, and even a lightning strike did not permanently disable it. Theoretically, they could continue their route to Murmansk or choose an alternate airport with clear weather. But the commander decides otherwise, to land immediately, at Sheremetyevo. At first glance, it makes sense. Home airport, familiar strip, nearby services ready to help. But there is a caveat: in these conditions, every minute of training in direct mode could play a role. The pilots did not have time to feel the car, to get used to its nervous reactions. And every move they made now could turn into a mistake. The co-pilot tries a backup communication channel. They manage to contact the dispatcher on an emergency frequency. Aeroflot 1492, we are requesting a refund. We have lost the radio, direct mode, he reports. The dispatcher confirms, copy that, 1492. Descend to echelon 80. At first glance, it's a calm dialogue, but the dry words hide the main thing. At that moment, the fate of the flight had already changed. Passengers don't understand much yet. The plane flies smoothly, only sometimes a slight tremor is felt. There are flashes of lightning in the portholes, but many people think that this is ordinary turbulence. Only in the cockpit is the atmosphere tense. The captain is increasingly squeezing the joystick, his movements are becoming sharper. The machine stubbornly reacts to the slightest deviations. The storm seems to be teasing around. Lightning flashes on the right, rain knocks on the fuselage, the wind changes direction. And although everything is still under control, every new kilometer makes the landing less predictable. The equipment has failed, but it is now up to the person to bring the car to the ground. The only problem is that the earth will not meet them as gently as the crew hopes. There comes a moment in the cockpit that sounds like a nightmare scenario to any pilot: silence on the air. The co-pilot presses the transmit button, repeats the call sign, changes frequencies, but in response there is only a dull hiss. The dispatcher's voices, the familiar instructions, the short commands, everything was gone. It feels like they've been pulled out of the system, left alone in the sky, where every decision will have to be made at their own risk. It's still invisible to passengers. They are sitting in their chairs, and all they can hear is the steady hum of the engines. Someone lifts the curtain of the porthole and sees a scattering of lights of Moscow behind the glass. Someone looks at the screen of the built-in monitor. Nothing unusual happens in their eyes. But the air in the cabin is getting thicker, the radio is silent. The crew immediately switches on the emergency code 7600. For the uninitiated, these are just numbers. There is a signal for the dispatchers on the ground: the plane has lost contact. On their screens, the flight marker changes color like a flashing beacon. Now everyone knows that this flight will not answer the call. But knowledge does not equal control. The crew is left to their own devices. The commander decides to try alternate options. A secondary radio communication system is in use, tuned to emergency frequencies. And after a few tense seconds, they hear the long-awaited voice: Aeroflot 1492, we accept you. The connection is hoarse, but it's there. This is enough to make you feel not completely cut off from the world. We are requesting a refund, loss of communication, we are working in direct mode, the first officer reports. His voice is calm, but there is tension in it. The dispatcher's response comes dry: copy that, 1492, go down to echelon 80. They don't realize yet from the ground that up there, the struggle is not for height, but for the very possibility of landing. Direct mode is not just another system. This is constant muscle work, concentration on every movement. Previously, the captain could afford to lean back in his seat while the automation kept the plane on course, but now every moment requires his attention. The car reacts nervously, jerkily, and each attempt to stabilize the trajectory resembles balancing on a tightrope. The commander calls the senior flight attendant. His voice still sounds confident: it's not an emergency, but we're coming back. For passengers, it will sound a little later like a routine announcement that does not cause panic. No one knows yet that it is at this moment that the fate of the flight is actually sealed. The dispatcher clarifies: do I need help landing? The first officer replies, "No, we only have a loss of communication and direct mode." This is a phrase that sounds casual, but in fact hides the scale of the problem. Landing in this mode requires exquisite precision, and the storm front ahead makes it an almost impossible task. The crew is following the direct mode checklist. Everything is written there dryly: smooth control, avoid sudden movements, and be sure to turn on the brake flaps after touching. Everything is simple on paper. But in reality, every point is a challenge. Especially if there is no time to work out. Still, the captain is in a hurry. He does not give a full briefing before boarding, does not discuss with the first officer how to act in case of an emergency. All attention is focused on one thing: to get back to Earth as soon as possible. This rush will be fatal. Meanwhile, a spectacle is playing out in the sky. Lightning flashes closer and closer, the wind increases, and the liner shakes every now and then. The cabin reacts in different ways. Someone has fallen asleep and does not even notice that the plane is behaving strangely. Someone is clutching the armrests, feeling that what is happening is more like rocking in a stormy sea than a calm flight. And although the crew has already received permission to land, Yevdokimov decides to take a break. He asks the dispatcher to give them a waiting area, a space where they can circle, stabilize the car and prepare. But for some reason the request is not recorded on the air, and the captain does not have time to repeat it. Fate seems to be pushing the plane towards the runway, leaving no extra minutes. The liner reduces altitude. The stormy sky ahead seems almost impenetrable, but that's where they have to fly. The radio is silent again, this time not because there is no connection, but because there are no more words left. There's only boarding ahead. And it promises to be much more difficult than any of them were ready to imagine. The steering wheel felt heavier in the captain's hands. The plane does not obey as usual, its every reaction seems to be doubled. In direct mode, the control is like working with a machine without shock absorbers. Any unevenness turns into a push, any movement of the hand into a jerk of the entire structure. And at the same time, thunderstorms, crosswinds, squally gusts. All this is mixed into a cocktail that can break even an experienced pilot. Yevdokimov understands that in such conditions, every kilometer is a risk. At first glance, it seems like the right decision to immediately board Sheremetyevo. Your airport, familiar infrastructure, and rescue services are literally at hand. But logic sometimes turns into a trap. Other airports nearby could offer clear skies and a calm approach. There's a storm here. And yet the decision has been made. The radio is intermittent, but the dispatcher confirms the descent vector. Aeroflot 1492, follow the course, descend. These words sound like a formality, but they conceal the main thing: the return is proceeding according to the scheme, but the scheme exists only on paper. In reality, the plane is in manual mode, the pilots are under pressure, and the elements are unwilling to let go. The captain drives the car down, and the height deviations become more noticeable. Instead of a steady decline, it goes dozens of meters lower, then rises higher again. The automation emits signals, warning of instability. Each such signal is like a reminder: the situation is getting out of control. In the cockpit, they follow the direct mode checklist. After touching, release the brake flaps manually, reads the first officer. This simple detail will be the key. In normal mode, the flaps come out automatically, pressing the aircraft against the runway, creating additional resistance and helping the brakes. But in direct mode, they won't work on their own. You will need to remember and press the lever manually. Yevdokimov nods, but his thoughts are already ahead, about landing. He does not discuss details with his colleague: how to act in case of a side gust, what to do in case of instability on the glide path, whether it is worth preparing in advance for the second lap. These words remain unsaid. The silence in the cabin turns into a missed opportunity. Outside, the liner enters the clouds. A white veil hides the lights of Moscow. In the cockpit, you can only hear the breathing of the pilots, the beeping of instruments and the patter of rain on the fuselage. At such moments, a person is left alone with the car. And the lives of dozens of people behind a thin partition depend on how he leads her on. At an altitude of 600 meters, the captain is trying to keep the set bar, but the deviations are increasing. Sometimes the plane goes 60 meters down or up, and each time the instruments emit alarm signals. It's like a siren that says, "You're losing control." But there is no time for training. The dispatcher gives them a course for the glide path. Aeroflot 1492, ILS approach, permission granted. Under normal conditions, this would mean a calm descent according to the arrows on the dashboard. But there are no arrows in direct mode. Only the crosshair of the horizontal and vertical lines, which the pilots must manually align. This is the most difficult type of entry, requiring delicate craftsmanship. And yet they continue. At this moment, there is a tense silence inside the cabin. No one is saying that you can step aside, take a break, wait for the weather to improve. All the attention is focused on the lane, which they haven't even seen yet. The wind is getting stronger by the second. A side stream hits the port side, causing the liner to list. The storm seemed to have decided to test their strength. Lightning flashes around, rain runs down the windows, and there is emptiness under the wings. And yet they are approaching the final straight. A little more, and the concrete strip will be under the wheels. But it is this, a little more, that will become the most difficult and dangerous stage of the entire flight. Because the elements were preparing the final blow for them. The plane goes on a landing course. The runway is only a few kilometers away, but it's those kilometers that will decide everything. From a height, it seems that the ground is just around the corner, but in fact this is the most difficult part of the flight. ILS, the instrument landing system, should help. Under normal conditions, the pilot sees clear arrows that indicate whether he is above or below the glide path, whether he has deviated from the course. There is no such luxury in direct mode. Instead of arrows, there are only intersecting lines. To keep the plane at the right point, you need to literally draw a trajectory in the sky with your hands. Every movement is millimeters, every delay is tens of meters of error. If Dokimov drives the car down, he deliberately takes it just below the glide path, so that he can catch the lane for sure, and not fly over it. At first glance, this is reasonable, but with a crosswind, such tactics turn into a risky game. The wind is blowing from the left, almost at right angles to the course. Its gusts reach 15 meters per second. This is no longer just wind, these are blows that can knock the plane off the trajectory at the last moment. The dispatcher reports, Aeroflot 1492, wind 160, 7 meters, I allow landing. Formal words, but they sound almost ironic in the cockpit. At this moment, the side current pushes the plane to the right, and the captain is forced to sharply deflect the joystick. The car reacts nervously. His every gesture seems to be reflected on the wings with a vengeance. At an altitude of 335 meters, the wind shear signal is triggered. This is a warning about possible sudden changes in wind direction and strength. For pilots, this is a red flag. The instructions instruct them to go for a second lap. But if Dokimov does not leave, he sees a streak in front of him and decides that he can handle it. A decision made in a second negates everything that textbooks teach. The plane descends further. At an altitude of 80 meters, another warning comes. Now the system says bluntly, glide path. This means that the liner goes below the permissible trajectory. The lights of the strip are below, and the captain decides to continue. He increases thrust, trying to pull the plane back onto the line. But the engines don't respond instantly. Precious seconds pass between the movement of the levers and the reaction of the turbines. For the first time, passengers begin to feel that something is going wrong. The plane falls through slightly, then rises with a jerk. In the cabin, it feels like rocking on a ship in a storm. People grab the armrests. Someone asks the neighbors out loud, "Is this okay?" There is no answer. The liner can hardly hold onto the glide path. Gusts of wind knock off course. The captain pulls the wheel, releases it again, pulls again. It's like a human struggling with a living being that resists every move. And yet they reach the threshold of the lane. Their height is 12 meters. The speed is 304 kilometers per hour, more than necessary. The nose is aligned, but it's too late. The system gives the command, retard, to reduce thrust. If Dokimov executes it, but the maneuver turns out to be belated. The plane is rushing towards the concrete faster than it should. The first lane lights flash under the wheels. One more moment and the touch will happen. But it is here that the elements strike the final blow, a sharp side gust. The liner is slightly off the trajectory, and the captain abruptly pulls the steering wheel back, trying to straighten out. The plane descends obediently, but too roughly. Concrete awaits them, and how they face it will be the culmination of this struggle. The aircraft touches the runway at a speed that is clearly higher than optimal. The wheels simultaneously cut into the concrete, the nose rack, the main racks, all together. The impact is recorded by the instruments as an overload of 2.55 g. For passengers, it's like their whole plane fell into a pit and immediately hit a stone wall. People in the seats jump up, their heads snap forward, and screams can be heard in the cabin. But the worst part is that the brake flaps don't come out. In direct mode, they are not activated automatically, and the crew, who are passionate about fighting the car, forgets about them. As a result, after the first touch, the liner does not press against the ground, but rather bounces off. In front of the dispatchers and eyewitnesses, the plane seemed to bounce over the runway, rising several meters again. At this point, the instructions are clear: with such a goat, you need to go to the second round. The plane has a chance. But if Dokimov makes a different decision, to try to land the liner again. He turns on thrust reversal, but the engines don't reverse because the car is still in the air. It turns out that the plane remains without the necessary braking, and the speed is increasing. The second touch is much tougher. The plane hits the concrete with its front strut, as if diving nose down. The overload is almost 6 g, almost twice the permissible for the chassis. The structure begins to collapse, the racks are creaking, the metal at their base is cracking, but the fuel tanks are still intact. The liner bounces off again, like a ball thrown against concrete. At this point, many passengers already realize that something terrible is happening. There are screams in the cabin, and someone jumps up, even though the straps are pinned to the seats. The third contact is the climax. The plane falls into the runway from a height of several meters, while the speed is still about 258 kilometers per hour. The impact is about 5 g. For the design, this is the point of no return. The landing gear struts break, tearing the fastenings. Metal fragments pierce the wings, damage the fuel tanks. At the same moment, a fire breaks out on the wings. Flames are shooting out from under the plane. In the cockpit, the pilots are trying to pull the steering wheel and give the engines thrust, but this is no longer possible. Reverse is enabled, and the instructions explicitly prohibit attempting to go on a second lap in such conditions. The plane completely loses the ability to take off again. He slides along the strip, leaving a trail of fire and sparks behind him. Eyewitnesses at the fences are filming what is happening on their phones. Their footage will then go around the world, an Aeroflot plane on fire, jumping along the runway like a wounded animal. Seconds after the third impact, the liner finally loses speed, turns to the left and stops. Flames engulf the rear of the fuselage. At this point, it becomes clear, the struggle for control is over. Now the fight for survival will begin. Everything happened so fast that the first seconds seemed unreal. The plane froze on the runway, but its body was shaking from the heat and vibration. Flames instantly engulfed the tail section, thick black smoke poured into the cabin through the torn panels. At that moment, for passengers who had recently been sitting relaxed with phones and magazines, reality turned upside down. An alarm pierced the cabin, the scream of automation and at the same time the scream of the elements themselves. People felt the temperature rise sharply. Someone in the back rows could already see the red glow through the portholes. There was still relative calm in the bow, the smoke reached there more slowly, the fire seemed to be something far away. But the difference in several rows of seats meant the difference between a chance and a trap. The crew began to evacuate. The voice of the senior flight attendant sounded firm, almost metallic. "We remain calm. Let's grab the straps." But there was no peace left. People were panicking, pulling on buckles, and someone was grabbing hand luggage, bags, backpacks, laptops. Everything that seemed important in peacetime was now delaying the seconds that were not enough for life. The first passengers rushed to the front exits. The inflatable ladders opened, hitting the concrete, and became the only bridge between the burning plane and the rescue. Someone rolled down them, someone fell and got on their knees, trying to run away. Screams and black smoke remained behind. In the cockpit, the crew was also struggling with the chaos. Evdokimov and the first officer turned off the engines, but the turbines spun up for a few more seconds, threatening to suck people and ladders into themselves. The hot metal roared as if resisting being stopped. Airport services were already on the runway. Fire trucks raced towards the liner, spraying foam and water. But the fire had an advantage. It rushed forward along the aluminum panels, devoured the plastic of the seats, turning the interior into a smoke trap. There was still visibility in the bow. People jumped onto the ramps, ran across the concrete, many in socks or barefoot. There is both panic and relief in their eyes. But in the back, the situation was getting desperate. There, the smoke was choking off breathing, and the fire was getting closer. The contrast was monstrous. There are open doors ahead, a chance for salvation, air and light. Behind him is a wall of fire and black smoke, in which you can barely make out the chair next to you. For many, time has stopped there. Sirens sounded at the airport. The dispatchers in the tower saw how on the strip, among the smoke and flames, people got out one by one. But each new frame showed that the flames were relentless. Just a minute ago, the plane was intact, metal, invincible. Now has turned into a fire trap. And in this fire, the last stage of the struggle was underway, no longer for the car, but for human lives. When the fire was extinguished and the evacuation was over, only a charred silhouette remained on the runway, a twisted aircraft body with black holes instead of windows. What looked like a symbol of progress a few hours ago has now become the subject of a thorough investigation. Every dent, every crack, every second of flight turned into evidence. The Interstate Aviation Committee began work almost immediately. The specialists collected the data from their black boxes, deciphered the negotiations and analyzed the instrument readings. The picture was coming together bit by bit, and the clearer it became, the more tragic the pattern became. The first link in the chain is a lightning strike. But it was not fatal in itself. The Superjet 100, like any modern airliner, is designed for such categories. This time, the automation turned off and switched control to direct mode, but there was no critical damage to the systems. The engines were running, the power supply was preserved, and the instruments were functioning. That is, technically, the flight could have continued, or at least the plane could have left for another airport. The second link is the commander's decision to return to Moscow immediately. The logic is clear, a familiar lane, help is nearby. But it was this decision that deprived the crew of time. In direct mode, management requires practice and quiet habituation. Evdokimov drove the car to land 21 minutes after the lightning strike. For such a situation, it is catastrophically small. The third link is the lack of a proper briefing. Before landing, the crew is required to discuss the details: how to act in case of instability, what to do in case of gusts of wind, what is the plan of departure for the second round. But this time everything went quickly. The checklist was completed formally, and some items were omitted. In particular, the critical point is that spoilers don't come out automatically in direct mode. They need to be released manually. This point was announced, but during the landing the captain forgot about it. The fourth link is the weather. Crosswinds and thunderstorms created conditions where any error increased significantly. The wind shear system required a second round twice. According to the instructions, it cannot be ignored. But the captain decided to continue. Perhaps it was fatigue, perhaps it was the desire to complete the flight as quickly as possible. But this decision has become a key one. The fifth link is the piloting technique itself. The video and the data from the recorders show that the movements of the joystick were abrupt, often impulsive. The plane fucked up because of the wrong reaction to the first touch. And each new blow became stronger than the previous one. On the second touch, the overload was almost twice as high as allowed. In the third case, the landing gear collapsed completely, piercing the fuel tanks. The report states, the main reason is the inability of the crew to handle the aircraft in direct mode. And this is a bitter conclusion. Because direct mode wasn't a disaster in itself. It required attention and gentleness, but with proper control, the airliner could safely reach the alternate airfield. Mistake followed mistake, and each one was reinforced by the next. A lightning strike is not fatal. Loss of connection is solvable. Direct mode is difficult, but not fatal. But when it all came together with haste, lack of discipline, and harsh weather conditions, the outcome was inevitable. This disaster has shown that there are no small things in aviation. Any detail, from the checklist to the choice of airfield, can decide where the line between a difficult flight and a tragedy lies. When the fire was extinguished and the lane cleared, there was a question that sounded louder than the sirens: how did this become possible? A modern aircraft, an experienced captain, the country's largest airport, everything looked like a guarantee of safety. But the chain of events has shown that even the most durable systems break down where the human factor takes effect. The first lesson is time. In direct mode, the aircraft can fly for hours. Nothing prevented us from going to an alternate airfield with clear weather, to St. Petersburg, Nizhny Novgorod or Minsk. There would be a calm approach, clear trajectories and less pressure. The decision to land immediately in Moscow turned out to be a trap. Instead of the time to adapt, the crew had only 21 minutes, and they went into landing before they had time to get used to the controls. The second lesson is discipline. Checklists in aviation are written in blood. Each item is someone else's mistakes, disasters, tragic experiences of the past. This evening, some of the points remained on paper. Spoilers that were supposed to pin the plane to the runway were not released manually. A pre-launch briefing, where scenarios are discussed, was not held. These little things have become decisive factors. The third lesson is respect for automation. The wind shear system required a second round twice. This is not advice, not a hint, but a categorical order. To ignore him is to defy the elements. And the elements responded. The fourth lesson is training. Pilots are used to working in normal modes, where automation smooths out errors. But direct mode requires a different philosophy, gentleness, patience, and long hours of practice. Training simulations showed that many pilots act too abruptly, trying to reverse the car. This disaster proved that training should simulate stress and give pilots the opportunity to experience such scenarios in advance. The fifth lesson is communication. There were two pilots in the cockpit, but their dialogue was kept to a minimum. The second officer was a novice and couldn't take the lead. The captain was too focused on landing, leaving his colleague in the role of observer. But it is the exchange of opinions, discussion of alternatives and joint solutions that often become the barrier that keeps from making a fatal mistake. When the investigation was completed, the conclusions were harsh: piloting error was the main cause of the disaster. But there was more to this dry term. It was a story about how a person chooses speed instead of caution in a moment of pressure, silence instead of discussion, stubbornness instead of maneuver. And yet, aviation takes a step forward out of every tragedy. After Flight 1492, the Aeroflot pilots' training was reviewed, the approach to working in direct mode was changed, and control over the fulfillment of checklists was strengthened. Because every disaster is a reminder, the cost of making a mistake in the sky is too great. On May 5, 2019, he showed that even where metal is durable, where electronics are perfect, everything is decided by man. His decisions, his self-control, his willingness to follow instructions, not on a whim. There is no place for improvisation in the sky, there is only precision. And this lesson will stay with aviation forever.